Whenever a new front office takes over for an old regime, there is generally going to be a lot of player turnover. We saw exactly the same thing when John Paxson took over the executive role once Jerry Krause stepped down after an abysmal 5 seasons trying to build the Bulls after the fallen dynasty. And after near 16 seasons of a combination of John Paxson and Gar Forman running the organization, boggles my mind that they kept them in that role for that long. But after 16 seasons at the helm, ownership said it's time to call it quits and usher in a new front office by bringing in Arturas Karnisovas and Mark Eversley, and I think we can all agree they have since made some drastic changes ever since being hired just near 18 months ago and have completely overhauled this roster to make the Bulls franchise a relevant organization once again, and that's what I want to talk about in this video. So what's going on, everyone? You are listening to Bulls Central here. Hope you're all doing well. Now, I remember the day when the Bulls announced that they had brought in a new executive vice president of basketball operations, effectively ending the Gar Pax era, and they brought in the GM from the Denver Nuggets. And this was well before I started this channel. It was during the height of the COVID lockdown. The season had been suspended, and we weren't quite sure if Bulls basketball was going to be returning that season, since it was speculated that the league would form some sort of a bubble with the only top teams in the league, which ended up being the case. But I was so down and bored after yet another disappointing season under Jim Boylen. The season was on hold, and when I saw the announcement on Twitter, I literally jumped out of my chair and did a little shout and clapped really loud to the point that it scared my 1-year-old daughter. It was the most exciting piece of news that could have been revealed for a Bulls fan after the season being put on hold, aside from the announcement that The Last Dance would be airing a bit earlier than anticipated due to the pandemic. Now, I share this with you because, one, it's a little embarrassing, and it's always fun to poke fun at how ridiculous our fandom can be sometimes, that news like that can be the highlight of our day in the middle of a pandemic lockdown, but more so because I knew this would finally signal a change to this roster. Drastic change, that is. A new coach, and it was from an executive who had done an impeccable job at building a small market franchise that was pretty irrelevant ever since Carmelo Anthony was traded to the Knicks. That being said, I didn't quite expect as big of a change to the roster as we saw and what we see today, which I should be clear I'm very happy about. But if you look at that roster from the 2019-20 season, at the time the league was suspended, and when Jim Boylen was still coaching his last game for the Bulls, there are now only 2 players who still remain on the Bulls team. Yes, just 2 players on that roster that are still with the Bulls today, and that is Zach Lavine and Kobe White. A complete overhaul of that roster, which was needed to be done as the roster at the time was going nowhere, especially under Jim Boylen. So how did we get here today? Well, first of all, the most important thing the front office did before the season started was firing Jim Boylen, which I don't know if you guys remember. It took a while after they were hired, meaning they, AKME, before they gave Jim Boylen the boot. There was even talk about that they wanted to give him a fair chance and not just immediately fire him, and the Bulls fans started going crazy at the idea of potentially keeping around Jim Boylen for yet another season. But they ultimately fired him, thank God, and they chose to hire Billy Donovan. Not quite the hire I was expecting, and I've said this before, I'm still not a huge fan of Billy Donovan in that hiring. I do think there were some better options available at the time, but Billy Donovan is still a solid coach in this league, and he is leaps and bounds better than Jim Boylen. Then, of course, when free agency hit, the front office didn't really make any big moves at all, actually. All they did was sign Garrett Temple to a 1-year deal, which ended up being a solid signing for them. But outside of that, no changes, at least in terms of additions anyway. And the front office had made it clear they were going to use this as an evaluation year to see how the current roster fit together, what were areas that needed to be addressed, and how to build moving forward. So I guess you could say the limited moves were to be expected, but kind of disappointing for Bulls fans. But we also knew we had to be a little patient. Outside of that, the Bulls decided not to extend the qualifying offer to Chris Dunn, making him a free agent, which I wasn't too happy about at the time, especially because they chose to prioritize that money in extending Denzel Valentine a qualifying offer, and I'm just glad they realized that was a mistake, and that experiment ended quickly with them renouncing his bird rights this offseason. The Bulls also did not extend an offer to Shaq Harrison, making him a free agent, and they also let Max Strus go. So overall, some pretty minor changes to start the season, and it really stayed that way until the course, we hit the trade deadline, in which the front office realized, yeah, we've seen enough. We need to make quick and swift changes to this roster. We're not going to wait for an entire season to play out, which I'll be honest, I was a bit surprised by the moves that were made at the deadline. I had made a couple of videos talking about how I wasn't going to be surprised if the Bulls stayed pat at the deadline and really just play out the rest of the season before making any big changes and waiting until the offseason, and could not have been more wrong myself, as we all know the Bulls made a blockbuster trade by bringing in the all-star big man Nikola Vucevic and Al-Farouq Aminu in exchange for Wendell Carter Jr., Otto Porter, and 2 first-round picks. Now, I've made videos in the past around that time frame on my thoughts on that trade and how the Bulls fared, so I won't go into that here. Rather, the purpose of this video is more just to discuss the timeline for which the front office revamped this roster. So Wendell, Otto out, Vucevic in. Then the Bulls also traded guys like Chandler Hutchinson, Lou Cornett, and Daniel Gafford, which the Gafford trade I'm still not that happy about because I really like Daniel Gafford. I really do think including him in the deal was premature, given he was only in his 2nd season in the league and was a really good big man off the bench for the Bulls. But be that as it may, you had those 3 guys out, and Troy Brown Jr., Devontae Green, and Daniel Tice come in. So after the deadline, you had 8 guys remaining on the roster from the 2019-20 season, and Ryan Arcidiacono, Cristiano Felicio, Zach Lavine, Lauri Markkanen, Tomas Satoransky, Denzel Valentine, Kobe White, and Thaddeus Young. So even with all of those big shifts at the deadline, a lot of the roster still remained. Then, of course, the Bulls closed out the season post-deadline in disappointing fashion by not even making the play-in, as it was clear this roster, although improved, really didn't have enough time to practice and become acclimated together to really start making any significant impact, especially in a compressed season. It also didn't help that Lavine had to miss nearly 4 weeks due to COVID. So this offseason, obviously we expected there to be changes. We all knew the Bulls were targeting various free agents, namely Lonzo Ball, and it was likely that the expiring contracts of various players weren't going to be extended, which of course ended up being the case, as the front office did not extend offers to Denzel Valentine, Cristiano Felicio, and Daniel Tice, as the Rockets paid him a handsome contract, which technically was a sign and trade in which the Bulls received cash considerations and a trade exception for. The Bulls declined the team option of Ryan Arcidiacono, again to be expected, and the Bulls also did fully guarantee the final years of the contracts for Thaddeus Young and Tomas Satoransky. However, they then used those contracts to flip them in a sign and trade. Satoransky, who was included in the sign and trade package for Lonzo Ball, while Thaddeus Young was included in the sign and trade package for DeMar DeRozan. Now, technically, the only offer the Bulls did extend to one of their free agents was the qualifying offer for restricted free agent Lauri Markkanen. And after nearly a month of free agency passing, the Bulls were finally able to facilitate a sign and trade, sending Markkanen to the Cavs, which the Bulls then received in return Derrick Jones Jr. and a first-round pick by way of a 3-team trade with Portland. And that's how we got to where we are today. A complete rehaul of the roster where only 2 guys remain. And of course, there is speculation on how long Kobe White will remain with the team now, because we've got Lonzo Ball, he was brought in, as well as other guards, and Alex Caruso and Ayo Dosunmu. My hope is that the Bulls do still hang on to Kobe and use him as a 6th man off the bench. See how he recovers from his injury to his shoulder, see how productive he can be in coming off the bench, and then assess from there, because you look at a guy like Kobe White, who has incredible work ethic and the desire to get better. He's only going into his 3rd season, only 21 years old. It's too early to just give up on him like that. So again, just Lavine and Kobe remain. I mean, that is some incredible work from this front office after what they were calling an evaluation year this past season, to completely flip this roster in a matter of months. Now, when you talk about how did this front office really do all of this, outside of just me telling you the moves that were made over the course of the last 18 months, well, I think it's important to call out the salary cap gymnastics that had to be exercised to make all of these transactions work. The sign and trade deals, which allowed them to offer big contracts to guys like Lonzo Ball and DeMar DeRozan, which enabled them to operate over the cap, since the moves were done through trades rather than signing the players outright, which wouldn't have enabled them to use those salaries to go over the cap. The fact that they leveraged the partial guaranteed contracts of Satoransky and Thaddeus Young, and rather than waiving them just to free up a little bit of cap space, they took the aggressive approach into fully guaranteeing their deals and then trading their contracts to free up even more cap space and leveraging said contracts for the sign and trade deals of Lonzo and DeMar. Not only that, but they also leveraged the restricted free agency of Markkanen by extending him a qualifying offer. One, to keep him a restricted free agent rather than having him become an unrestricted free agent if they did not extend it to him, but then using that as an asset to then sign and trade Markkanen to the Cavs and getting Derrick Jones Jr. and a first-round pick and a second-round pick in return for Markkanen, a guy they could have very well lost for nothing. Look, I work in finance and procurement, so part of my job is to negotiate contracts and leverage deals, and what this front office was able to do in using their pieces to their advantage and getting the best possible return on their assets was absolutely phenomenal. I'm not saying all their moves were A-plus level transactions. I know we gave up a lot for DeMar DeRozan, especially when he was already a free agent anyway. I know we offered him a pretty big contract for his age, but overall their approach and strategy from completely turning this team around, a team that was in the dumps, irrelevant, to now being a fun and exciting team to watch again, is what makes this feat all the more special. I want to know what you guys think though. What were your thoughts on the reconstruction of this roster in the short time frame? Let me know in the comments, and as always, be sure to subscribe if you're a Bulls fan, as I do post daily Bulls content. Thanks again for tuning in, guys, and I will catch you in the next one.